In this module, I want to go over some rules to remember or some advice on how to form the perfect indicative forms given the particular type of the verb. So if you notice, we've been breaking down our verb vocabulary by grouping them into regular verbs, contract verbs, and with the regular verbs, I would also include verbs with stops, and then liquid verbs, and then finally the irregular verbs, which have either a very unstable stem that changes all the time or more than one stem. And so there are a couple of rules or guidelines to form the perfect tense for each of these groups. I won't go over the regular verbs because they're regular, but let's go over right now the contract verbs. And the thing about contract verbs is that it's a very easy rule. Just like with the aorist tense, contract verbs compensatory lengthen when they form the perfect tense. So if I were to form, if I want to say I have loved, here's my reduplication. Remember that with the short vowel, reduplication is the long, you make it long. So it's a, ga, and then here is my compensatory lengthening. Instead of alpha becomes an eta. Ega peka is I have loved. For the epsilon, it also compensatory lengthens to an eta. So my reduplication here is this alpha turning into an eta. A, ka, lu, and here's my compensatory lengthening. Apalutkeka is I have followed. And then for plerao, here's my reduplication, pe, play, and this is an omicron. This compensatory lengthens to an omega. So pe pleroka, oops, I forgot the rho. There we go. Pe pleroka is I have filled. The next set of rules have to do with liquid verbs. And like the aorist tense, liquid verbs tend to have a slight stem change when it forms its perfect forms, and those stem changes are often not predictable, and therefore you have to memorize it as part of your vocabulary. So remember that for every vocabulary verb, so every vocab verb, you are memorizing its lexical form, its verbal root, and the 6 principal parts. And here's a really good reason why you need to memorize 6 principal parts. Because for the perfect tense, especially for liquid verbs, the stem undergoes a slight change. So you might have iro, which I take up. Now its verbal root is r, and it's one of the few perfect tenses that has no stem change. So it just simply takes the verbal root. And so here's your reduplication. Here's the stem, add ka to it, and erka is I have raised. But look at crino. Its stem in the present tense is crin, but it's not going to use that. It's going to be cri. So here's reduplication, ke. Here's your perfect stem, cri, and then you add ka to it. So kekrika is I have judged. And notice that it sounds easier to say kekrika than kekrinka. And so a lot of times the irregular stems that develop is simply a way for Greeks to say the word more easily. And then for apostello, here's a big stem change. Apostel with a double lambda is the lexical form. The verbal root is apostel with a single lambda, but this undergoes a change. It becomes apostal. Now the apa is a preposition. Here is your reduplication, adding the epsilon. Here is the perfect stem, stal, and here is ka, your suffix ending for the perfect. So apostalka is I have sent. On this screen, I listed out some of the liquid verbs that you'll find in an extra handout in your learning activity on vocabulary. There you'll have all the liquid verbs listed, and you'll be asked to fill in these columns. And where there is no form that exists in the perfect tense for a particular verb, those are left blank. So these lines mean that it doesn't show up in the New Testament, therefore you don't have to worry about it. But for the words that we've gone over so far, iro, notice that it tells you whether there's a stem change or not, and for iro it's one of the few that don't have a stem change. And to say I have taken up or I lift up is erka, and to say I have been lifted up, or the middle form, I myself have lifted up, it's ermai. We also went over krino and showed that it has a stem change kri, and so its perfect form is kekrika and kekremai. We also went over apostello, and we noticed that, and we showed that its stem change is apostal. So to say I have sent is apostolka. To say I have been sent is apostolmai. And so go over all the liquid verbs you know so far, note the stem change, and note what form of the perfect shows up in the New Testament. So do it for these verbs and the additional verbs that are listed on your handout, not shown here. So we've gone over some special rules for the contract verbs and for the liquid verbs. And now we're going to go over the irregular verbs. And the rule is, know that some of these irregular verbs have irregular stems. And so the only way to memorize, the only way to remember the perfect forms is to memorize the stem for the perfect active form and for the perfect middle passive form. So I've listed a lot of the irregular verbs you've come to know and love, and the verbal roots that form the tenses for the verbs. And what you're going to be doing is, like I did here, for all the regular verbs, fill out what are its perfect forms, noting, for example, that kaleo has clay as its stem for the perfect, or ginomai uses the second perfect and it uses gone as its irregular stem, and erkamai, using a modified form of the verbal root adluth, has its reduplication here, but also in the middle, so it doesn't reduplicate the epsilon, it reduplicates this part right here. This part gets reduplicated. And so lelutha is I have come, I have gone. And so all the forms are listed here on this chart. They're also, again, listed in the back of mounts. Part of what you'll be doing as your vocabulary memorization is memorizing these stems for the irregular verbs as part of your principal parts vocabulary. And what about stops? Are there any special rules for stop verbs? The answer is yes, but these special rules only apply for the middle and passive form. So this is not something you have to worry about in the active forms. For the middle passive forms, there is a slight stem change, and many of these stem changes for the labials, the velars, and the dentals are basically phonetic. It's a way to soften the perfect middle passive forms. And so I've charted them out here, and there is a pattern to it. One of the first patterns for the labials, the velars, and the dentals, that's probably the easiest to understand, is in fact the dental pattern, where regardless of whatever the verbal root is, but in this case for patho, I entrust, it's path. Whatever this dental is right here, that dental turns into a sigma all the way through the perfect middle and passive indicative. So that's the easiest. More difficult is discerning the patterns between labials and velars. And generally what I would like to say is that if you look at the first person singular and the first person plural, the labials and velars try to soften the sound, and they do it by two different ways. The labials tend to reduplicate the mu of the mai and the metha, so it drops the labial and instead has another mu added to the stem. So gegrammi is simply a way to soften. If they were to use the original stem, it'd be gegraph my, and that's really a bit hard to say. So over time, the softer gegrammi became grammaticalized, and so for the first person singular and first person plural, you have gegrammi and gegramitha. Now, the velars also, in the first person singular and first person plural, try to soften the stop, but the way the velars do it, it uses what we call the unaired stop. So aired stops, if you recall, have a puff of air being enunciated as you say the letter, but the unaired stops don't have that puff of air. So there's a big difference, for example, between a gamma, g, and a kappa, k. You see much more air with the kappa, and so the unaired stop is what's used for the first person singular and first person plural. So if diok is the stem, then notice that the kappa has turned into a gamma for the first person singular and for the first person plural. So you have de diogmai and de diogmitha. For the second person singular forms, notice that it really doesn't matter what the bilabel is, just by the nature that the second person singular ends with a psi, you're automatically going to get the affricative. So because the sigma combines with whatever the stop is, you get the affricative. So for bilabels, the affricative is the psi, and for the velars, the affricative is the kasi. And then for the you see this, and then for the second person plurals, because the stem that's added begins with a theta, it aspirates the stop. So notice that it aspirates the stop. So whatever the aspirate is for the stop, because it's a th sound, what happens is that the sigma drops, and instead, so you're expecting to say suthe, but that the sigma drops. Instead, the stop aspirates, and so you get gegraphthe, and then for the bilabel as an example, and de diochthe for the second person plural for the velars. And then the final pattern is that for the third person singulars, notice that instead of the unaired stop that you see with the first person singular and first person plural, you actually get the aired stop. So you get the letter that has that puff of air. So for the bilabels, it's a P, so it's gegraptai. And then for the velars, it's the kappa, so it's de dioktai. And that's for the third person singular forms. Lastly, the third person plural. Notice that I highlighted it in orange, and the reason why I did that is because the third person plural, for reasons of history, dropped its form, and so Koine Greek no longer uses the third person plural. Instead, it uses a form of a me plus the perfect participle. So this is a form of a me plus the perfect participle, a form of the me and the perfect participle. But you haven't learned participles yet. Participles is a grammatical form that will be learned after the midterm toward the end of the semester. So for now, you will not be responsible for the third person plural form, for stops in the perfect and middle passive indicative, and you'll learn how to use the participle to replace the third person plural form in a later lesson.